On the night of my son's 21st birthday, I thought I was giving him the greatest gift a father could ever prepare. I had spent years planning it, saving it, protecting it. I handed him a folder filled with stock certificates worth more than he could imagine, a fortune that could change his life forever if only he had the patience and wisdom to see it. But instead of joy, instead of gratitude, I saw disappointment in his eyes. He did not even touch the papers with respect. He looked at me and asked a question that cut through my heart like a sharp knife. "Where's the sports car I wanted?" In that moment I understood something terrible. My son, the boy I had raised with love and sacrifice, had grown into a man who did not understand the value of what I had built for him. He wanted speed, shine, and noise, not security, growth, and future. He wanted the easy thrill of a car instead of the quiet power of wealth that multiplies silently over years. And I stood there, folder in my hand, feeling like everything I had tried to teach him had vanished in the air. That night was only the beginning of a story I never thought I would live, a story where a father's gift turned into a son's burden, and where the true meaning of wealth and respect would take time, pain, and loss to be understood. Lydia, my daughter, was standing near the kitchen table, her arms folded as if she already knew her brother would react badly. She was always able to read people better than I ever could. Maybe because she had my late wife's sharp intuition. Maybe because she spent more time listening than speaking. But her silence said more than words could. She knew her brother was blinded by desires he could not afford, and she knew my heart would be heavy after hearing his careless question. I looked at my son and I wanted to tell him everything. How those stock certificates were not just pieces of paper but keys to a door of stability, a chance to live without fear of rent or hunger, a path to multiply wealth if he chose wisely. But instead of explaining it with anger, I simply said, "Son, this is worth more than any car you could buy today. If you take care of it, it will take care of you for the rest of your life." He rolled his eyes and mumbled something under his breath, something that sounded like useless papers. And then he set the folder down like it had no weight at all, when in truth it carried the weight of my sweat, my years, my sacrifices, and my trust. Lydia came closer and placed her hand gently on my shoulder, as if to remind me that not all was lost, that at least she understood. And for a brief moment I looked at her and felt a strange mixture of pain and pride. Pain because my son had failed to see the gift, pride because my daughter had not. The celebration that night was hollow after that moment. The cake tasted like cardboard, the laughter felt forced, and though I smiled for the sake of family and friends, inside my chest there was a heaviness that refused to go away. After everyone left, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the folder that lay on the table, untouched, unwanted, almost like an orphan child that no one wanted to claim. Lydia came and sat beside me. She whispered softly, "Dad, don't worry, he will understand someday." But I shook my head because I was not sure anymore. I had given him the foundation for a strong future, and he had thrown it aside like trash. How could he understand when his heart was filled only with the hunger for flashy things? Still, Lydia's voice was like medicine to me that night, and I prayed silently that she was right. The next morning my son left early. He did not say thank you. He did not even glance at the folder. And by evening he was gone with his friends, celebrating in bars, posting pictures of himself pretending to be a man who had it all, while I sat at home looking at the empty chair and wondering where I had gone wrong as a father. Maybe I had given him too much comfort. Maybe I had shielded him from the hardships that would have taught him to value money. Or maybe he was simply too young, too impatient, too blinded by this modern world of instant pleasures. Days passed, and the disappointment grew into a quiet wall between us. He barely spoke to me except when he needed something, and each time I looked at him, I saw not the little boy I once carried on my shoulders, but a stranger who thought love was measured by shiny gifts. It hurt, and it hurt in a way that only a parent can understand, a pain that is silent, a pain that hides behind forced smiles, a pain that grows heavier with every careless word. And right now, if you are listening to my story, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. Please like this video. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, which city, because it matters to me to know how far my story has reached and how many hearts can understand this pain of a father. After all, stories like mine are not just mine. They are shared by many parents around the world who give their all only to be misunderstood by the children they love the most. But let me go back to where I was, because the story did not end with his disappointment on that birthday. No, it was only the start, the calm before the storm that would soon show both him and me what value really meant. A week later, I found the folder still lying in his room, collecting dust, untouched like a book no one wanted to read, and I picked it up carefully, tucking it back into my drawer because I could not bear to see it treated that way. Lydia asked me quietly if I regretted giving it to him, and I told her no, because gifts from a father to a son are not about regret, they are about hope, and I still had a small hope, faint like a dying candle but still alive, that one day he would wake up and realize what I had truly given him. But hope is a dangerous thing when the person you are hoping for is careless, and soon enough the cracks in his life began to show, cracks that would lead him to a place he never imagined. He spent recklessly, he partied with friends, he borrowed money for things he did not need, and then the day came when he stood at my door, his eyes tired, his voice lower than usual, and he said, "Dad, I need money for rent." My heart sank because I knew what it meant. He had nothing left, no savings, no plan, and worst of all, no respect for the gift I had given him. I asked him about the folder, and he shrugged like it was a piece of garbage. That was when I realized he had sold his bike, the one thing he loved, the one thing he polished every weekend, the one thing he used to call his escape. He sold it just to cover his rent. And in that moment I saw the full picture. My son was lost, and he was walking blindly into a hole that would only get deeper unless he learned a painful lesson. Lydia stood behind me in the hallway, her eyes filled with disappointment, not anger, just sadness, because she had hoped too, and now her hope was breaking. I told my son that night, "One day you will understand what I tried to give you, and that day you will remember this conversation." But he shook his head and walked away, not realizing that the lesson was already beginning, that life was already sharpening its edges to teach him what I could not. After that night when my son asked me for rent money, and I found out he had already sold his bike, something inside me shifted. It was not just disappointment anymore. It was a realization that life itself was going to be his teacher, not me, because no matter how many words I used, no matter how many examples I gave, he would not listen until reality forced him to. And that thought was both painful and strangely relieving. Painful because I did not want my son to suffer. Relieving because maybe that suffering would finally wake him up. Lydia noticed how quiet I had become in the following days. She kept asking if I was all right, and I would just nod because what could I say? A father's silence is sometimes louder than his words, and she understood me without needing details. I remember one evening, she sat beside me on the porch. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, and she said softly, "Dad, maybe he has to fall before he can rise. Maybe this is the only way." And her words stuck in my mind because I knew she was right. Sometimes people have to lose something valuable before they learn its true worth. My son started spending more time away from home after that, sometimes disappearing for days, and when he returned his eyes looked tired, his voice sounded rough, and his pockets were always empty. It became clear to me that the lifestyle he wanted was slipping away from him, and he had no plan to catch himself when he fell. He would argue with me whenever I asked about his future, saying things like, "Don't worry about it, Dad, I'll figure something out." But there was no something. There was nothing, just wasted hours and careless choices. I held back my lectures because I knew they would fall on deaf ears, but Lydia, she could not stay silent as easily as I could. She confronted him one night at dinner, telling him he was throwing away his opportunities, that Dad had given him something precious and he was too blind to see it. He snapped back at her, his voice sharp, accusing her of being Dad's favorite, of always trying to act perfect. And for a moment I thought he might walk out of the house completely, but he didn't. He just slammed his fork down and stormed into his room. That night I could hear Lydia crying softly in her room, not for herself but for him, for the brother she loved who refused to love himself enough to change. I wanted to comfort her, but what comfort could I give when I myself felt powerless? Days stretched into weeks, and the gap between my son and me widened until he barely spoke to me at all unless it was about money, and I learned to accept the silence, though it broke me every single time. I remember one Saturday morning when I found the folder again. I had kept it locked away in my drawer after seeing him neglect it, but something inside me told me to check on it, and when I opened the drawer, I just stared at the papers for a long time, thinking about all the sacrifices those papers represented. I remembered working long shifts, skipping vacations, driving an old truck while others bought new cars because I wanted to build something lasting, something my children could depend on, and yet here I was, holding proof of my sacrifice that my son had called useless. My hands trembled with both anger and sadness, but I calmed myself, because anger would not fix him, patience and time might. Lydia found me there, staring at the folder, and she sat down beside me and said, "Dad, don't let this break you. You did the right thing. Maybe not for him right now, but someday he will know." Her voice was strong, but her eyes carried the same fear I carried, fear that maybe he would never learn, maybe he would destroy himself before he understood. The turning point, or at least what felt like the start of one, came a month later when he showed up at the house with a look I had never seen on his face before, not pride, not anger, but shame. He avoided my eyes when he asked, "Dad, can I stay here for a while? I don't have enough for rent this month." My chest tightened because I wanted to say, "I told you so." I wanted to shake him and scream that this was exactly what I tried to protect him from, but instead I simply nodded and told him his room was always there for him. Lydia stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, watching him quietly, not with hatred but with a kind of guarded hope, as if she wanted to believe this was the first step to change. That night when he went to bed, Lydia came to me and said, "Dad, this is your chance. Don't just shelter him, guide him, even if he doesn't want to hear it." Her words made sense, but guiding someone who refuses to be guided is like pouring water into a closed jar. It just spills everywhere and goes to waste. Still, I promised her I would try. The following days were heavy with tension. He would spend most of his time in his room, coming out only for meals, and whenever I tried to talk about responsibility or future, he would either change the subject or brush me off. I knew I had to wait for the right moment, the moment when his heart would be open enough to hear me, and I prayed silently for that moment to come. I remember one particular evening when Lydia and I were sitting at the table going over some bills, and he walked in, his face pale, his voice low, and he said, "Dad, I don't know what to do. I'm broke and my friends don't even talk to me anymore. They've moved on." That was the first time in a long time that he admitted weakness, and I knew this was the moment, the small crack in his wall of pride. I gently pushed the folder toward him, the same one he had rejected, and I said, "This was never useless, son. This was your safety net, your chance, and it's still here waiting for you. But you need to change the way you see it, because if you don't, no amount of money will ever save you." He looked at the papers, his fingers trembling as he finally picked them up, really picked them up, not like before, not with disdain, but with curiosity, maybe even respect. For the first time, I saw in his eyes a flicker of realization, faint but real, like a light trying to break through clouds. Lydia was watching from the doorway, her lips pressed tightly together as if she was holding back tears, and I knew she was feeling the same fragile hope I was feeling. That night he did not say much, but I saw him sit in his room, staring at the certificates for a long time, and though I did not know what thoughts ran through his head, I knew something was changing, something small but important. Still, change is not a straight path. It is a road full of stumbles, and I had no idea just how many stumbles lay ahead before he would truly learn the lesson life had prepared for him. The days after he finally picked up the folder felt strange, almost like living in a fragile balance, because for the first time in years I could see that my son was actually thinking instead of just reacting. He would sit at the table with the papers spread out in front of him, His forehead creased as if he was trying to decode a language he had never studied. And though he did not ask me for help directly, I could feel the questions running in his mind, questions about value, about money, about what those certificates really meant. Lydia watched him carefully during those days, her eyes never leaving his movements, and she told me one night, "Dad, he's curious now. That's a good sign. Don't push him too hard. Let him come to you." Her advice was wise because I had learned that forcing lessons only builds resistance, but giving space sometimes lets the seed of understanding grow on its own. Still, patience was not easy for me because every day I feared he might toss the folder aside again, dismissing it as meaningless, and I did not think my heart could take that kind of rejection twice. But instead of throwing it away, he began asking small questions, questions that felt clumsy but honest, like, "How does this work?" or "Why does a company even give these?" And though he tried to sound casual, I knew those words were heavy with hidden humility, because for him to even ask meant he had to admit that he did not know, and that admission was something his pride had always hated. I answered every question gently, explaining in the simplest terms, telling him how stocks represented ownership, how they grew in value, how patience turned them into something greater, and I could see his eyes flicker with both confusion and fascination, like a child trying to solve a puzzle for the first time. Lydia joined us sometimes during these talks, and she would smile softly, watching her brother lean in, nod, scribble notes, and I could tell her heart was filling with the same cautious hope that was slowly returning to mine. But change never comes without struggle, and soon the storm returned, because learning about responsibility is not just about money, it is about character, and character is not built in a week. One evening, after a long conversation about savings, he suddenly said, "But this takes too long, Dad. Why can't I just cash these and buy something now? At least I'll enjoy it." And those words cut through me because they reminded me of the very same impatience that had made him reject the gift in the first place. I tried to stay calm, telling him that quick pleasure disappears but slow growth lasts, but he shook his head and said, "I'm tired of waiting. I've been broke for months. I need something real right now." I saw Lydia's face fall when she heard that, her hope draining like water through her hands, and I feared we were slipping back into the same darkness we had barely escaped. That night I could not sleep. I sat in my chair staring out the window, wondering if all my efforts were wasted, if maybe he would never understand until he lost everything completely. But then I remembered Lydia's words about letting him fall so he could rise, and I realized maybe this back and forth was part of the fall. Maybe it was necessary for him to wrestle with the conflict inside himself. A few days later he came home later than usual, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes red, and when I asked if he was all right he simply muttered, "I don't want to talk about it." Lydia told me later that she heard from a friend that he had gone to a party, tried to show off like old times, but nobody cared. Nobody treated him the way he wanted, and he came back feeling smaller than he ever had before. That night I heard noises from his room, the sound of him throwing something, maybe a book, maybe a chair, I could not tell, but I did not go in because sometimes a man needs to wrestle his demons alone. The next morning he came to the kitchen, sat down with his head in his hands, and whispered, "Dad, I don't know what to do anymore. I feel like I'm failing at everything." My heart broke hearing that, but at the same time a strange relief spread through me, because admitting failure is the first step toward change, and maybe he was finally ready to rebuild. I placed the folder gently in front of him and said, "Son, you don't have to do this alone. I've already laid the foundation. You just have to learn to respect it. And if you do, it will carry you when you can't carry yourself." He nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes, and for the first time in years I saw humility in him, real humility, not just words. Lydia came in and saw him like that, and she quietly placed a cup of coffee in front of him, her small gesture saying more than any speech ever could. It said, "I forgive you, I believe in you, and I am here." He held her gaze for a long time, maybe realizing how much he had hurt her before with his sharp words, and though he did not say sorry, His silence was heavy with it. Over the following week, something truly began to shift. He spent less time outside with empty friends and more time at home, reading about investments, asking me questions, even taking notes like a student, and I felt a cautious pride growing inside me, pride that maybe I had not failed completely as a father. Still, I knew the road ahead was long, because knowledge is one thing, discipline is another, and discipline requires more than curiosity. It requires strength to resist temptation. One Friday evening, he came into the living room holding the folder tightly and said, "Dad, I think I get it now, but I'm scared. What if I mess this up?" His voice trembled like a child, and I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "You will make mistakes, everyone does, but that's how you learn. The real mistake is giving up before you start." Lydia smiled from the doorway, her eyes shining with quiet pride, and for a moment, just a moment, our family felt whole again, like the fractures were healing. But life has a way of testing lessons before they stick, and I knew deep down another storm was coming, one that would challenge everything he had just begun to understand. And when it came, we would all find out whether he had truly changed or whether it was only another fragile phase that would shatter under pressure. The weeks that followed were like watching a fragile plant grow in rocky soil. Every small sign of progress from my son felt like a victory. Yet I could not escape the constant fear that one wrong choice, one careless temptation, could pull him back into the same darkness he had been drowning in for so long, and I knew life was not done testing him yet. He had started waking up earlier, sometimes even joining me on the porch with a cup of coffee, asking questions that showed he was at least trying to understand what responsibility looked like. Lydia noticed the changes too, though she remained cautious, reminding me one evening while we washed the dishes, "Dad, he's improving, but don't let your guard down. We both know how quickly he can slip." Her words were true because I had seen the pattern before, hope followed by disappointment, effort followed by collapse, and I prayed this time it would be different. One Saturday afternoon he came to me with the folder again, his voice steadier than before, and he said, "Dad, I've been reading about these companies, but it's hard for me to see how pieces of paper can really matter. I mean, I get that they're worth something, but how does that change my life right now?" His question was not disrespectful, it was genuine confusion, and I took a deep breath before answering. "Son, these papers are not magic, they don't fix everything overnight. They are like seeds you plant in the ground. If you water them, if you protect them, they grow into trees that give you fruit for years. But if you throw them away because they don't give fruit immediately, you end up with nothing." He sat quietly after hearing that, nodding slowly, and for the first time I thought he truly understood what patience meant. Lydia walked in during the conversation and gave me a small smile, the kind of smile that carried both relief and pride, and I could tell she was silently thanking me for not giving up on him. But just when things seemed to be settling, the storm came, as I knew it would. A week later, he received a call from one of his old friends, the kind who always lured him into trouble, inviting him to a weekend trip out of town, promising parties, girls, and the kind of wild fun he used to crave. I overheard him on the phone, his voice wavering, torn between old desires and new responsibilities, and my heart pounded in my chest as I waited to see which path he would choose. That evening he told me directly, "Dad, they invited me, and honestly I want to go. I've been feeling trapped here just reading about numbers and papers. I need a break." His words cut me deeply because I knew this was a critical moment, the kind of crossroad that shapes a man's future. I wanted to forbid him, to lock the door and say no, but I also knew he was 21, an adult by law if not by wisdom, and my control could only go so far. Instead I told him calmly, "Son, you're free to choose, but remember every choice has consequences. If you go back to the old ways, you might lose the progress you've made, and sometimes rebuilding is harder than starting." He frowned, clearly frustrated with my words, and stormed out of the room without answering. Lydia came to me later and whispered, "Dad, maybe he needs to make this choice on his own. Maybe if he fails again, it will finally sink in." Her words hurt because I didn't want him to fail, But I knew she was right. Sometimes pain is the only teacher strong enough to change someone. That weekend he left, and I spent the longest 2 days of my life packing the house, praying, hopping, fearing, while Lydia tried to keep me calm, reminding me that we had already done what we could. When he finally returned on Sunday night, his face told me everything before he even spoke. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his wallet empty, and the shame radiated from him like heat. He sat at the table without a word, and after a long silence he whispered, "Dad, I messed up again. I spent money I didn't have. I tried to keep up with them, but they laughed at me when I couldn't. They don't care about me. They just use me." His voice cracked, and tears spilled down his face, the tears of a young man who had finally seen the truth he had been avoiding for so long. I sat beside him and placed my hand on his back, saying softly, "Now you see, son, the people who matter don't use you, they guide you, they stand by you, and that's why I gave you that folder, not because it's about money, but because it's about building a life that doesn't collapse when others walk away." Lydia stood quietly in the doorway, tears in her eyes too, and for the first time in years I saw my son break, not the kind of break that destroys a man, but the kind that strips away his pride and leaves room for growth. That night he apologized to both of us, not just with words but with the sincerity that comes only when someone hits rock bottom. He said, "I should have listened. I wasted so much time chasing things that don't last. I don't deserve another chance, but I want to try." Hearing those words filled me with both pain and relief, because though it hurt to know how much he had lost, it also meant he was finally ready to rebuild. The following weeks were different from anything I had seen before. He wasn't just curious about the stocks anymore. He was determined. He sat for hours reading. He asked questions. He even took advice from Lydia, which shocked me because before he never respected her opinion. Slowly, the boy who once rolled his eyes at me was becoming a young man who wanted to learn. But change is never a straight road, and though his effort was real, I knew there would be more trials ahead, more temptations waiting to test him, and deep inside me I wondered if the lesson of responsibility would stick this time, or if another fall was still waiting just around the corner. The weeks after his return from that disastrous weekend trip were some of the strangest and heaviest I had ever lived, because while on the surface my son seemed calmer, more willing to listen, I could sense the storm of guilt and determination fighting inside him, like he was standing at a cliff, terrified of falling again but desperate to climb. Lydia became his silent partner during this time. She would sit with him in the evenings, showing him how she budgeted her small salary from the part-time job she held, explaining how every dollar had a purpose, how planning was the only way to avoid sinking into debt. And for the first time, I saw him watching her with respect instead of irritation. Sometimes I would sit back quietly and just observe them, my daughter teaching my son lessons he should have learned years earlier, and I felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because Lydia had grown into a woman of such strength and wisdom, sorrow because my son had to be taught what should have been second nature by now. One evening he came to me with the folder again, his voice quieter than before, and he said, "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe it's not too late to start over. Maybe I can actually make something out of this if I really try." His words were simple, but to me, they felt like a door cracking open, a small but vital shift that might finally lead him down the right path. I told him, "Son, it is never too late as long as you are willing to learn, but you have to understand this. Money is not the goal, it is a tool. If you treat it like a toy, it will destroy you. But if you treat it like a responsibility, it will build you." He nodded, and for the first time his eyes didn't wander or roll. They stayed fixed on mine with a seriousness I had been waiting to see for years. Lydia overheard us and later whispered to me, "Dad, I think he's finally listening." But I reminded her gently, listening is one thing, living it is another. We'll see if his actions follow his words. The next test came sooner than I expected. A few days later, he received a message on his phone from the same group of friends who had mocked him on the weekend trip, inviting him to another party, promising that this time it would be different, that he wouldn't have to spend anything. I watched his face pale as he read the message, and then to my surprise he handed me the phone and said, "Dad, delete it. I don't want to go back to that." My chest swelled with pride in that moment, not because he asked me to do it, but because he finally recognized his own weakness and chose to cut it off. Lydia clapped her hands lightly, almost like a child celebrating a small victory, and she said, "That's the brother I've been waiting for." He smiled at her, a small, shy smile that carried both shame and gratitude, and I felt the air in the house shift, lighter than it had been in years. Yet the real test was not about rejecting parties. It was about proving discipline in everyday life. I gave him a small task the following week, asking him to track the household grocery expenses and compare prices from different stores, something that might seem small but required focus and responsibility. At first he fumbled, losing receipts, forgetting totals, but instead of giving up he came back to me, frustrated but determined, saying, "I want to get this right, Dad, show me again." Those words, "show me again," were sweeter to me than any apology could ever be because they carried humility, the willingness to admit he didn't know and the courage to try again. Lydia teased him gently about how serious he looked while counting every dollar, and for the first time in a long while, I heard genuine laughter in our home, not forced, not hollow, but real laughter shared between siblings who were beginning to rebuild their bond. Still, deep inside me I knew this was only the beginning of his transformation, and life would not let him pass without testing him harder. That test came when he applied for a part-time job at a local hardware store, his first real attempt at standing on his own 2 feet. He came to me the night before the interview, nervously asking, "What if they don't hire me? What if they see me as some spoiled kid who doesn't know anything?" I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "Then you try again somewhere else. Failure isn't the end, it's the beginning of growth." The next day he came back home with a wide grin on his face, waving a small slip of paper. "Dad, they hired me. I start next week." Lydia hugged him tightly, laughing through tears, and for a moment I felt the weight of years lifting off my chest. Watching him prepare for that job, ironing his old shirts, rehearsing polite greetings in the mirror, I realized he was finally beginning to understand the dignity of effort, the pride that comes not from what is handed to you, but from what you earn. His first paycheck was small, barely enough to cover his own expenses, but when he brought it home, he placed it on the table and said, "Dad, I want to contribute, even if it's just a little." My eyes burned with tears I tried to hide, because that single gesture meant more than all the careless gifts he had demanded in the past. Lydia squeezed his hand and whispered, "This is the start, don't stop now." And yet, even in this moment of growth, I knew the shadow of his old desires still lingered, because habits built over years don't vanish overnight, they lurk in the corners, waiting for weakness. A week later I caught him browsing on his phone late at night, looking at sports cars again, the same dream that had once blinded him. When he saw me, he quickly closed the screen, ashamed, and whispered, "I know, Dad, I know. I'm not ready yet, but I promise I won't go back." I believed him, but I also knew the road ahead would test him again and again until his will was stronger than temptation. Lydia remained his constant support, guiding him gently, never mocking, always encouraging, and I realized that without her, he might never have begun this journey at all. One evening as we sat together, Lydia turned to me and said, "Dad, maybe the real gift wasn't the folder, maybe it was the lesson you planted, and now he's finally ready to let it grow." I looked at both of them, my children, one steady as a rock, the other learning to stand, and I felt a rare peace fill my heart. But I also knew the story wasn't over, because every lesson in life comes with a final test, and his was still waiting just around the corner. The weeks that followed his first paycheck were like watching the slow but steady rise of the sun after a long, stormy night, because my son began to show me glimpses of the man I had always hoped he would become. And yet I could not let myself believe too quickly, since I knew how fragile new beginnings could be, like a flame that flickers in the wind before it steadies into a true fire. He came home from work each evening with tired eyes, but also a strange pride in his step, telling me small stories about customers he had helped, how he had learned to cut wood to size, or how he had managed to explain a drill to an older man who didn't understand the instructions. They sounded like ordinary things, but to me, they were proof that he was learning to respect effort, to respect service, to respect the dignity of working with his own hands. Lydia, of course, was always there to cheer him on, making jokes about how he smelled like sawdust or how he should be careful not to hurt himself, and he laughed with her instead of snapping back like he once would have, and that alone was progress worth celebrating. Still, I knew that life would not allow him to walk this new path without placing stones in the way, and sure enough the test arrived, not in the form of friends inviting him to waste money, but in something much heavier, something that would show me whether he had truly begun to value what I had given him. One evening he came home looking pale, his hands shaking slightly, and he told me that one of the managers at the store had offered him a shortcut, a chance to make quick money by manipulating invoices and pocketing the difference, something small at first, something that would not be noticed right away, and the temptation was powerful because it promised him the kind of instant reward he had always chased. I listened to him carefully, my heart pounding because I knew this was the crossroads, the place where all my teachings, all his struggles, all of Lydia's encouragement would either hold him steady or collapse like sand. He said to me, "Dad, a few months ago I would have taken it without thinking, I would have thought I was clever, but now I feel sick even imagining it." I looked into his eyes and asked, "So what will you do?" And his answer came soft but firm, "I'm going to report it. I'm not going to be that person anymore." My chest swelled with a pride so heavy it almost brought me to tears, because in that moment I saw not just words but action, not just regret but resolve. Lydia hugged him tightly and whispered, "That's my brother, that's who you're meant to be." And I knew she was right. He had finally reached the point where his choices reflected growth instead of weakness. But life, cruel and just, did not stop testing him there. The manager he reported was fired, and for weeks after that, my son had to endure cold stares from some of the other employees, whispers behind his back, even direct insults from those who thought he had ruined a man's livelihood. I worried that this pressure would break him, that he would backslide into the careless boy he had been, but instead he stood taller. He came home every night and told me, "Dad, I did the right thing, even if they hate me for it. I'm not going to let anyone push me off the road I finally found." Hearing those words made me realize something important. He was no longer just learning discipline. He was beginning to live by principle, and that is something far more valuable than money. Still, the folder of stock certificates remained untouched in my drawer, the gift that had started all this pain and transformation, and I often wondered when he would finally see it not as paper but as the foundation of his future. Lydia asked me one night, "Dad, are you ever going to tell him how much it's really worth?" And I shook my head, saying, "Not yet. He's not ready to carry that kind of weight. The value of it will crush him if he doesn't have the spine to hold it." She nodded slowly, understanding in her quiet way, and we both agreed that the day would come when the truth would be revealed, but only when he had proven himself completely. That day arrived in an unexpected form. A letter came to the house addressed to him, from the brokerage firm that managed the stocks, informing him of dividends that had accumulated over the years, a sum large enough to shock him. He rushed into the kitchen, letter in hand, his face white as snow, and he shouted, "Dad, what is this? Is this real?" I took the letter from him, read it slowly, and then nodded. "Yes, it is real. It is part of what I gave you." His knees almost buckled as he sat down, whispering, "I didn't know. I thought it was just paper. I thought it was nothing." Lydia smiled gently and said, "That's what Dad has been trying to teach you, that the things that look boring and simple are sometimes the most powerful." He stared at the letter for a long time, then looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I wasted so much time wanting things that would have disappeared in a year, and you gave me something that could last a lifetime." I reached out and held his hand, squeezing it firmly, and I said, "Son, I don't care how much time was wasted. I care about the man you are now, because it is never too late to start walking the right road." For the first time since that painful birthday night, he embraced me, truly embraced me, not with guilt or fear but with gratitude and love, and I felt years of silence break apart inside me. From that day forward, he treated the folder differently, keeping it in a safe place, reading about the companies, asking me questions, even researching on his own, and I could see the spark of real responsibility igniting inside him. But deep in my heart, I knew the story was not finished, because while he had begun to change, the final test of any man is not how he handles paper or paychecks, but how he handles crisis, and I could sense that such a moment was coming for him, a moment that would decide whether his growth was permanent or just temporary. I prayed quietly at night, asking for the strength to guide him through it, because soon he would face something greater than temptation or money. He would face the kind of loss or trial that defines who a man truly is, and when that time came, I knew the folder would no longer matter, only his character would. The crisis I had feared came sooner than I expected, like a storm rolling in on a day that seemed clear only moments before, and it struck in a way none of us could have predicted. One evening, while my son was closing the store, a group of young men came in, angry and desperate, trying to steal some expensive tools. My son, who only months ago would have run from responsibility or even joined the wrong side of trouble, now found himself standing between them and the register. He told me later that his heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break his chest, but he also said he remembered the lessons, the quiet words I had repeated to him all his life, about courage not being the absence of fear but the decision to act even when fear is heavy on your shoulders. He didn't fight them. He didn't play the hero, but he calmly pressed the alarm button under the counter, tried to reason with them, and managed to stall just long enough until the police arrived. The young men were arrested, and though my son was shaken badly, the manager told me that if it hadn't been for his calm head, someone could have been hurt. When he came home that night, his hands were trembling, and he whispered, "Dad, for the first time I felt like I wasn't just living for myself, I felt like I was protecting something bigger." Those words struck me hard, because that was the exact moment I knew my boy had finally become a man. Not through money, not through gifts, but through character forged in fire. Lydia cried when she heard the story, hugging him tightly, and I sat in silence, proud beyond words but also humbled, because the boy who once asked for a sports car instead of stocks was now the man who had risked his safety to do the right thing. From then on, everything began to shift. He treated people differently, with respect and patience. He listened instead of rushing to talk. He saved instead of wasting. He planned instead of drifting. The folder that once seemed like useless paper became his most prized possession, not because of the money inside it, but because of what it represented. The turning point in his life, the proof that discipline, patience, and sacrifice carry rewards far greater than momentary pleasure. I finally told him the full truth, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, the folder open between us. I explained every company, every dividend, every long night of sacrifice I had endured to buy those stocks when I could have spent the money on myself. I told him how I had driven old cars, worked overtime, skipped vacations, all to make sure that when he became a man he would not have to start from nothing. His eyes filled with tears as he listened, and when I finished he looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude and said, "Dad, I don't deserve this. Not after the way I treated you." I reached across the table, gripped his hand tightly and said, "You didn't deserve it then, but you do now, because a fortune means nothing in the wrong hands, but in the right hands it can build a future." Lydia, sitting quietly beside us, smiled and said, "This family is stronger than money, stronger than mistakes, stronger than pride." And in that moment I realized she was right. We had come full circle. The sports car he once demanded had vanished from his dreams, replaced by plans of investing further, maybe even starting a business that could one day provide jobs for others. He began talking about giving back, about teaching young men the lessons he had learned so painfully, and I knew that my journey with him was reaching its destination. He no longer saw me as an obstacle or a disappointment, but as a guide, a father who had refused to give up on him even when he seemed lost. The story that began with heartbreak on his birthday ended with a bond stronger than ever before. It was not the stocks themselves that mattered, nor the money they represented, but the transformation they forced, the pain that became the soil from which growth bloomed. One evening as the sun was setting, he sat beside me on the porch and said, "Dad, one day I want to do for my kids what you did for me, even if they don't understand it at first, because I know now that love isn't always about giving what someone wants. It's about giving what they need, even if they hate you for it in the moment." I could not have asked for a greater reward than those words. Lydia brought out iced tea. The three of us sat together, and for the first time in years I felt peace, the kind that comes when you know the storms have passed and the seeds you planted have finally taken root. My son was no longer the boy who sold his bike to pay rent because he wasted what was given to him. He was now the man who carried the weight of responsibility, the man who could face temptation and fear with a steady heart, the man who would honor the gift and build something greater from it. That night, I looked at both of my children and whispered a prayer of gratitude, because life had tested us, broken us, and then rebuilt us stronger. This story I have told you is not just about stocks or cars or money. It is about love that refuses to give up, about patience that waits through pain, about discipline that finally blossoms into character. If you are listening to me now, remember this. The things that glitter are not always gold, and the things that seem dull may carry the power to change your life forever. Hold on to what truly matters, even when others laugh at you for it, because in the end, respect, love, and character are worth more than any sports car. And now, as I close this story, I want to tell you the same thing I told my son. Wealth without wisdom is a curse, but wealth with wisdom is a blessing that can last for generations.